Hey everyone, welcome to Sports Betting 101 brought to you by BTB Analytics. In this series, we're going to talk about everything in sports betting from the basic concepts to some of the more advanced things that professional sports bettors use in order for you to be a profitable winning sports bettor. And the reason we're doing this is simple. The sports books are making billions of dollars off of their users because they don't understand some of these core concepts of how to spot a good bet and how to avoid a bad one. So, what we want to do is go over some of the basic building blocks to begin with to arm you with the tools you need to win in the long term. And we're going to start this by our first lecture, which is all about reading a betting screen and some of the basic terminology. And I promise you, even though this is the intro first lecture, you will end this knowing things that most of your friends do not know or understand, and you will be better off for it. So, in this lesson, we're going to talk about the main types of bets, what the odds mean, and why they're so important to you being able to win money, and how the sports books try to trick you into losing bets and losing your money over time. Now, the main types of bets when you open the bet screen are going to be these three things: spread, total, and money line. Now, I want to start by saying everything in this lecture is going to be under the context of straight bets. And straight bets are kind of what most of you are probably familiar with. It's just betting on one outcome, aka one thing to happen, versus a parlay, which you're betting on multiple things having to happen all at once for your bets to win. We're just going to focus on straight bets first to get some of these building blocks down. So, like I said, you're normally seeing these three options of types of bets: spreads. When spread is just the amount the team must win or lose by. And so we'll talk about what that means for favorites and underdogs and how to read that on the betting screen. And then one thing I want to point out, if you're betting sports like baseball or hockey, you're going to see instead of a spread, it's going to be called the run line for baseball and the puck line for hockey. Those are just spreads. Those are other words for spread. And the reason they do that in baseball and hockey and these low scoring sort of events is that typically they're always 1.5 points either way versus high scoring events like basketball and football. They just call them spreads because they can be really any number. We're also going to talk about the total, which is the combined points scored in a game, and the money line. That's just a scenario where your team just needs to win outright. So the most common type of bet you're probably going to hear about and you probably may want to bet on are the spreads here. And so when you are looking at any particular game, let's kind of walk through what you're actually looking at. So the most important thing is, well, what is the spread, right? And so when you're looking here, the minus sign means that a team is a favorite. They're expected to win. This is also called betting chalk. And so the favorite, when you're betting a spread, this means that they must win by an amount more than the spread for your bet to win. So in this example, we're looking at college football, Alabama versus Florida State. So a spread of minus 11.5 for Alabama means Alabama must win by 11.5 points or more for them to cover. Now, we're going to talk about why there's a 0.5. Obviously, there's no half points in football. We'll talk about why that is in a second, though. So when you talk about favorites, again, with the minus the points there, this is called giving or laying points because all that means is you're taking whatever Alabama's final score is and you're subtracting 11.5 points from that. And that new total has to be higher than what Florida State's score is. So that's why they call it giving points or laying points. Now, on the flip side, you can take an underdog, and those are teams where there's a plus sign, right? And so it's the exact opposite. So the underdog they can either win the game outright, or more commonly, they have to lose by an amount less than the spread for your bet to win. So again, in this example, we're looking at Florida State. They are plus 11.5 points, which means they must lose by 11 points or less, or again, they could win for them to cover this spread here. And this is called getting points because, again, you are adding points to whatever your score is, and that new total has to be higher than what Alabama's total is in this scenario for them to cover. So we talk about the 0.5. Why is that there? So most spreads have a 0.5 on the end of the number to prevent what's called a push. And a push is just a tie for your bet. And so what happens is if a bet is a push, then it's void. It's like it never happened. The bet is canceled and you get your money back. Now, again, I'm talking just about straight bets here. In parlays and teases, which we'll talk about in another lecture coming up, something completely different happens depending on how you built that. But this point five was also called the hook, and you'll probably hear that spoken as well. So you would hear somebody saying, "Oh yeah, no, they've got 11 in the hook. Alabama is giving 11 in the hook, or Florida State is getting 11 in the hook here." Now, again, I mentioned this is another example. So looking at Iowa State versus Kansas State, you can see the spread here is +3 and -3. And so if this game were to end where Kansas State won exactly by 3 points and you took this spread bet, it would be a push. You would get your money back and it'd be like the bet never happened. Okay. Moving on to totals. Again, very, very simple, like the name suggests. So you see the O and the U. O stands for over. And so what that means is both teams' combined points must be higher than the number listed at the end of the game if you're taking the over for that bet to win. So again, looking at Alabama and Florida State, if that game ended in a, let's say, 42 to 14 beatdown, that's 56 combined points the over would have hit. And then the under is the exact opposite. Both teams' combined points must be lower than the number listed for that bet to hit. And again, you see there is the point five there. That's just to eliminate any pushes. So no matter what happens, there's going to be an outcome, right? Either you're going to win or lose that bet. There's no possibility of a tie here. Now, I do want to point out some caution here. Keep in mind overtime rules in sports where there are no ties. So let's use MLB as an example, right? So if you have a team that is a team to, or a total for a game that is over 8.5, right, and both teams are tied 4-4 going into the ninth, well, the over has technically already hit, right? Because games can't end in the tie, and someone's going to have to score one more run for that game to be over, or to at least win by one run for that game to be over. So the nine is effectively in play. Same thing for college football. Think about the overtime rules where first overtime it's touchdown and PAT. Then second overtime you have to go for a 2 point conversion, and then third overtime it's just competing, alternating 2 point conversions until someone wins. Right. So just keep that in mind because sometimes with some of these key numbers you may have chances for ties which can push you over on the total there. And one thing you'll probably hear commonly is they don't call it undertime, right? They call it overtime in sports. And so just something to keep in the back of your mind. Doesn't mean that you should bet unders more. It's just something to be aware of. Okay, and then money line, finally, the team just needs to win the game. And in these scenarios, if the game ends in a tie, well, then your bet is void and your money is returned because you're betting on a team to win. And if no team wins, then it's like the bet never happened. Now, I want to call out something. Let's look at soccer, for instance. So you can see it in this matchup between Arsenal and PSG. There's Arsenal to win, there's PSG to win, but then there's also a draw. And so you see this draw option. What this means, this is kind of, it's called a three-way bet. So this means that Arsenal has to win in regulation time for your bet to hit, or PSG in regulation for your bet to hit. If neither team wins, or if the game ends in a tie, well, then if you bet on Arsenal or PSG, then you've now lost your money because there's a third bet of it actually ending directly in a tie. And the reason I bring this up, especially if you're only betting the four major sports, is you're going to start seeing a lot more of these options for, again, football, basketball, etc. And these are more common in like quarter bets. So, who's going to win the first quarter, team A, team B, or will the first quarter or first half end in a tie? We're going to talk about more about these types of bets and why they're kind of sucker bets, but just understand that those exist. And if you're betting money line, just make sure you're not betting money line when there's a draw option as well, because that's not quite the same thing. All right. So, what do these odds mean? In this example, I'm talking about the numbers in green here next to spread, total, and money line, because this is the most important thing you have to know when you're starting to bet here. So, simply put, and how most people think about odds are used to calculate your payout, and they're centered around $100 wager. And then what I mean by that is if we look at these numbers here, so let's look at the spread. We see that Alabama's at minus 11 and a half, and those odds are minus 110. So when you see a negative number, that means that's the amount that you would have to risk to win $100. So again, in this example, if you took Alabama spread, you would need to bet $110 to win $100 profit. which means you'd walk away with $210 total. The original $110 you used to bet, and then the $100 you won from the sports book, right? And then if you're looking at positive odds, this is the amount that you would win if you bet $100. So again, let's look at Florida State money line at plus 330. That means you would win $330 if you bet $100. So again, you'd walk away with $430 total. Your $100 original bet plus the 330 the sportsbook gave you. Now, obviously, you don't have to bet $100 on these sports books to make a bet, but that's just the rates or the conversion. So if this were $10, right, you would win $33, for example, if you bet on Florida State. And then if you wanted to bet $10, that means you'd have to risk $11 on the spread to win $10 for either Alabama or FSU. And the most important part, if you remember nothing else from this lecture, it's that odds are not the same everywhere. And so if you live in a state where you have multiple sports books, do yourself a favor and price shop. And what price shop means is just simply going through the different apps and seeing what their odds and numbers are for these games. And I'll give you an example. Again, we're looking at Alabama, Florida State. You can see here that Florida State, if you were an FSU backer, you can get them for plus 330 here on DraftKings, and the total is set at 50 and a half. But if you look at FanDuel, the total is set at 51 and a half. And look, if you want to back Florida State, they have it at plus 340, right? So you would win an extra $10 for every $100 you bet if you wanted to bet on Florida State. So if you're a Florida State backer, you should bet at this game at FanDuel, not DraftKings. Now, if you want to take the under, you'd be better off betting at FanDuel because the under here is 51 and a half compared to DraftKings where it was 50 and a half. So you're getting an extra point to play with. Now, reverse, if you wanted to bet the over in this game, you'd want to bet it on DraftKings because it's 50 and a half. So it means that the total only has to hit the 51 compared to 52 at FanDuel. So these little things absolutely add up. And if you've been betting so far, I'm sure you've probably heard either from yourself or from the internet or maybe your friends of, oh man, the spread or the total, it was 1 point off, or it was so close. Like, sports betting is absolutely a game of inches, and we'll talk in future lectures as to why that is. But every point matters. The sports books are not your friend, they are your enemy. So you absolutely want to take advantage of them whenever you can. And the easiest way to do that is to find where the best odds are for your bet that you want to place. Okay, so what most people don't know about odds. Again, we just talked about odds in terms of the payout for you. But there's actually something far more important that people just don't understand, especially those who have been betting for a while, or what we call amateur sports bettors, that leads to their demise. So we talk about this. It's the most important thing to being a profitable sports bettor. But odds are just the book's probability of a team winning or covering. And what I mean by that is, let's look at the money line, for instance. All those numbers mean the minus 425 or plus 330. We call those American odds when they're whole numbers like that, minus and plus. It's just a conversion of what the book is saying a team's chances of winning are. So let's look at this. So at minus 425, what that actually means is DraftKings is saying Alabama has an 81% chance of beating Florida State just outright in this game. And at plus 330 odds, they're saying that Florida State has a 23% chance of beating Alabama in this game. And this part is so important to becoming a profitable sports bettor, because at the end of the day, how you spot good bets and avoid bad ones are being able to convert those odds to percentage of chance, or we call probability, to see where there are mismatches, where things don't line up. And this is one of the things that I think people don't necessarily understand. The sportsbook's biggest advantage over you as a sports bettor is that they control the odds, they control the payouts, right, of what you're betting. Your biggest advantage over the sports book is you get to pick and choose what bets you want to bet. You don't have to bet every game. You can be very selective. And let's use college basketball as an example. There were over 350 D1 men's college basketball teams, and the sports books are putting up a line for every single game. Well, they're gonna have some really bad ones. If you know how to spot a bad line, you can absolutely pick them off and win money. So, going back on that, let's look at the spread here. So, what you're most commonly going to see are minus 110 odds. And again, this is just a formula, and we'll talk about how to calculate this in another lecture coming up here. But for now, let's just know that minus 110 means that it's a 52.4% chance of happening. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, well, hold on. If the spread is minus 110 for Alabama and minus 110 for Florida State, how can both sides have a, a greater than 50% chance or a favorite chance to happen? That doesn't make sense. If you add those two together, it's over 100%, right? And if you were paying close attention when I talked about the money line, I said Alabama has an 81% chance of winning and Florida State has a 23% chance of winning. Well, if you add those together, that's 104. Again, that's more than 100. That doesn't make any sense, right? Well, that extra percentage there is what's called the juice or the hold or the vig, aka vigorish. And it's just the tax that the sports books put on you. And so think about it this way. If one person bet $110 on Alabama to cover the spread, and one person bet $110 for Florida State to cover the spread, well, if the bet just ended there, they took no more bets, no matter who ends up covering, the sportsbook's going to profit because remember, they're only paying out $100. So they collected $220 and they're going to pay somebody $210, right? Their original $110 they used to make the bet, plus their $100 winnings, and they're going to come away with $10. Now, multiply this by millions and millions of bets, and you can see here that the sports book sort of has an easy way out to profit. Now, in the real world, this doesn't happen, right? They're not looking to get necessarily equal amounts of action on both sides of one bet at one number. And we'll talk more about that in the next lecture as to why. But just understand that that tax, that is what makes the sports books their money. And that's why it's so hard for you as a sports bettor to be profitable because 50-50, just winning half your bets, is not good enough. If you won half your bets at minus 110, you'd actually be losing money. So keep that in the back of your mind. So to be a profitable sports bettor in the long run, it's not good enough to just think a team will win or cover. This is what they want you to do, right? This is exactly how the sports books makes their billions off of users. They want you to think that, hey, you watch basketball, you watch football, you have a favorite team, you understand, if the team is going to win a game or if they should, win by a touchdown, whatever. And over the long run, that's absolutely a losing strategy because there's so much more that goes into how they get that number. So you must be able to quantify their chances. And then what I mean by that is just saying that, again, we go back to the Alabama Florida State example. If the book is saying that Alabama has an 81% chance of winning, and you say, no, 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 they actually have a 90% chance of winning. Well, then that's a good bet for you because Alabama has a better chance than what the book is offering. Or maybe an easy way to think about that is if the book says the spread is Alabama should win by 11 and a half points, and you say no, a good bet is Alabama will win by 14. I predict that Alabama will win by 14 points or more. Well, then again, the minus 11 and a half would be a good bet for you, but it's not good enough to just think that. As you become a smarter bettor, you're actually going to want to start applying numbers to this, right? So not just I think they'll cover minus 11 and a half, but how many points exactly will they cover that you predict and how many is too much, right? So yeah, they'll win by 11 and a half, but they won't win by 27 and a half, right? So at some point you have to know when a good bet becomes a neutral bet and when it becomes a bad bet based off your predictions. And so in the same light, if you calculate the probability is worse than what the book is offering, it's a bad bet. And spoiler alert, this is most of the bets that are on your screen, especially if you're waiting until right before a kickoff or a tip off to place a bet. By that time, these numbers are really, really sharp. And it's not Vegas doing this, it's professional sports bettors who are hammering out this number. So you're not just betting against Vegas, you're actually betting against, all the other sharp action that's out there, or the professional sports better action, who are influencing the lines moving and the numbers becoming so close to what the actual outcome is in a lot of cases. And so if you don't know how to do this, we're going to provide these tools for you both in this series and on our website and from our offerings. And that's a big part of what we do. It's not just guessing, it's not just saying, oh, well, we know who's going to win, because that's not true. We actually go through and mathematically quantify what is a good bet. So it's not just team A will win, but it's team A will win by this many points at this price or odds, i.e., minus 110. That's all those things together is what makes a good bet. And if you listen to sharp bettors, truly sharp bettors, professionals who do this, they don't say, oh, I like Alabama to win. They say, I like Alabama to win at this number, right? At this price. And that's the key difference between professionals who actually win money and amateurs who don't over the long run. So, how do sports books trick you? And this is the last thing we'll talk about today, and it's really important because people tend to think that Vegas is rigged, right? That Vegas is some magic entity and it's colluding with athletes and sports leagues to affect the outcome so they can win bets. And that could not be further from the truth. If for nothing else, they have a way more effective and easier way to take your money, and they do it by the odds. And most people don't even realize that they're being cheated when they open up their sportsbook apps, right? So unfavorable odds is actually how the sports books, rig, so to speak, sports betting. And so what I mean by that is there are certain types of bets that are really stacked against you, and you probably don't realize it. So until you kind of get further along and really understanding how to calculate and spot a good price bet and a bad price bet, you want to try to avoid these bets when possible. So one is bets where there are minus 115 or greater odds on both sides of a spread. So again, the example we use, you saw that there is minus 110 on both sides. That's standard. It's still a tax, right? But it's standard. When you start seeing minus 115 or minus 120 on both sides, those are bets where no matter what happens, the sports books are for sure going to profit in the most part. And you really want to try to stay away from those because it makes it really, really hard for you to win money and profit in the long run if you bet those minus 115, those minus 120 bets compared to those minus 110 bets. And that's something called the break even percentage, which again, we'll talk about in a future lecture, but it's the key thing. So try to avoid those. Try to avoid bets with only yes option. These are called one-sided bets. And what I mean by that is, here's an example: player points totals for the Bucks here, and you can see here where, let's look at Giannis for instance. You can see that it's 34 plus. So it's saying that you're betting that Giannis will have 34 points or more at minus 110, but it doesn't give you the option for 33 points or less, right? It only lets you bet the over. It doesn't let you bet the under. These are one-sided bets, and what the book tries to do is give you horrible odds for the actual number, and there's no way you'd ever be able to know that because you can't see the no option, or in this case, the under option. So try to avoid these bets. If you want to bet points, for instance, for like a player prop, then you want to see it where it says over and under. And again, we'll talk more about player props and other bets in another lecture here. Parlays with reduced payouts. So you can Google parlay calculator and it'll give you the actual fair value of what a parlay should pay out based on the individual odds for each leg here, or each bet is what we call it. And this happens a lot. So reduced payouts and bets with only yes options are notoriously found in same game parlays. So for the time being, again, unless you know more about parlays, and once we get to that lecture, we'll talk about how to make a good parlay and a bad parlay. Until we get there, you definitely want to avoid same game parlays because these payouts are almost always terrible for what they should be. And spoiler alert, same game parlays and parlays in general are the sports book's biggest money maker, and it's not even close. They want you to do it. There's a reason that every time you open up your app, you see promos for same game parlays. You see advertisements for same game parlays. They want you to bet these because they know they can make money off of you. Even if you win, they're still making money off of you. Okay. And then finally, win, lose, or draw bets, like we talked about in the soccer example, where it's not just when each one team needs to win or the other team wins. It's one team can win, the other team can win, or they can tie. You want to avoid those bets as well because again, the payouts aren't they aren't good for in most scenarios. And until you know how to spot a good payout or a bad payout, it's best to avoid them because 9 times out of 10, it's going to be a bad payout. And then buying points here, we'll talk more about this later, but in the spread, you have an option of changing what the spread can be. So again, in our Alabama example, we saw the spread was minus 11 and a half. Well, you can do what's called buying points. You can make it instead of 11 and a half, you can make it 10 and a half or 9.5 or et cetera, et cetera. But the lower the number is for favorites, the more you have to pay. Same thing for underdogs, right? So if Florida State was plus 11 and a half, you can make it plus 12 and a half, plus 13 and a half, et cetera. But you're having to pay more to do that. And it seems counterintuitive, but when you buy points, again, over kind of a large sample size, you're likely to win more bets, but you're actually losing more money. Yes, you will win more actual bets, but you will be losing money over time. And we'll talk about why that is. So that sounds weird, but it's a true phenomenon. The sports books don't want you to realize that. Okay, so just very briefly, we're not going to talk about these in this lecture, but we will have other lectures dedicated to this. Other types of bets, we're going to talk about parlays. And within parlays, we're also going to talk about teasers, round robins, and again, same game parlays. You're going to hear a lot of people say parlays or sucker bets, and that's not necessarily true. How most people use parlays, they definitely are sucker bets and they're bad bets. But if you know what you're doing, you can actually make parlays an effective tool for your sort of betting arsenal, if you will. So we'll talk about how to make a good parlay and what traps to avoid. We'll also talk about player props and also team props and futures. So in our next lecture, we're going to talk about types of sports books and how lines are made. This is one of the most important things, one of the things that are so commonly misunderstood by sports bettors. And knowing when to bet, knowing why and how lines move can absolutely win you more bets just by changing the time and day of when you place your bet. It's very simple, but most people don't even realize that. So if you like this content, please give us a like and subscribe so you can see our future videos. Feel free to drop comments and questions, things you want to learn about next. We'll be happy to address those. And as always, you all, good luck.